Thank you, Martha. When the Baal Shem Tov had a difficult task before him, he would go to a certain place in the woods, light a fire, and meditate in prayer, and then he was able to perform the task. A generation later, the Maggid of Mezrich was faced with the same task, so he went to the same place in the woods, but he'd forgotten exactly how to light the fire as the Baal Shem Tov had done. He said, I can no longer light the fire, but I can still speak the prayers. And so he prayed as the Baal Shem Tov had prayed, and he was able to complete the task. A generation later, Rabbi Moshe Lev had to perform the same task, and he too went into the woods. But not only had he forgotten how to light the fire, he'd forgotten the prayers as well. He said, I can no longer light the fire, nor do I know the secret meditations belonging to the prayers, but I do know the place in the woods to which it all belongs, and this must be sufficient. And it was. But when another generation had passed, Rabbi Israel Salanter was called upon to perform the same task. He sat down sorrowfully and said, I cannot light the fire. I cannot speak the prayers. I do not know the place in the forest, but I can tell the story of how it was once done, and that must be sufficient. And it was. I imagine that many of you remember where you were when you heard the news of President Kennedy's assassination. I imagine that some of you also may remember where you were when you heard the news that Dr. King had been assassinated in Memphis. Robert Kennedy that night was in Indianapolis, and he had the difficult job of breaking the news of King's murder to a black audience in that city where he was campaigning for president, just about 2 months before he himself would be assassinated. And he spoke that night about an ancient Greek play, a play full of bloodshed and retribution and endless cycles of violence, until at the end of this play, the Oresteia, the Furies who had been pursuing Orestes for killing his own mother, relent and become instead the Eumenides, the kind goddesses, when justice is finally tempered by mercy. I have bad news for you, Kennedy said, for all our fellow citizens, people who love peace all over the world, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and killed tonight. King dedicated his life to love and justice for his fellow humans, and he died because of that effort. My favorite poet was Aeschylus. He wrote, "In our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair against our will comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need is not hatred, not violence or lawlessness, but love and wisdom and compassion toward each other, and a feeling of justice to those who still suffer in our country, whether white or black. So I ask you all to return home tonight to say a prayer for the family of Martin Luther King, true, but more importantly, to say a prayer for the country all of us love, a prayer for understanding and that compassion of which I spoke. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past. We'll have difficult times in the future. This is not the end of violence. It's not the end of lawlessness. It's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and black people want to live together to improve the quality of our lives. They want justice for all the people who abide here. And so let us dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of the world. The meditation this morning is familiar. It's the Serenity Prayer. It's become common in 12-step groups, but it was actually written in wartime. It was given to soldiers during World War II. It was written for veterans, for civilian casualties of war, for the orphans, for the widows, and Reinhold Niebuhr's daughter said that her father's words were intended to address inconsolable pain, loss, and guilt. This was his version, written in 1943. God, give us the grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, and courage to change the things that should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. We all experience trauma in our lives. The American Psychiatric Association didn't recognize PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, until 1980, when it was included in the DSM-3, that big book that describes all of the supposed psychological disorders and their symptoms. And the decision to include it was controversial at the time, but the ancient Greeks knew all about trauma. The Bible recognized trauma. Shakespeare knew about trauma. It's a phenomenon that touches us all, and modern medicine is just catching up to ancient wisdom. The Buddha recognized it. Life is suffering. That was the first noble truth. And some of this suffering is just the normal everyday wear and tear of living. It's when you're on the phone with the insurance company or on hold with the doctor's office for 20 minutes, or it's when those home improvement projects that take 2 minutes on YouTube take 2 weeks in real life. This is stress, it's frustration, it's annoyance, it's irritation, it's a fact of life. But the Buddha also taught that there are more extreme forms of distress. If the word dukkha in Sanskrit means suffering, then dukkha is suffering raised to the nth degree. And this too, at some point in our lives, occurs to almost all of us. How many cartoons have you seen where there There are two half-starved men. They're shackled to a dungeon wall, hanging by their wrists. They have beards halfway down their chests. Their clothes are in tatters, and this becomes, the situation for the joke. The worst part is, I just can't get access to my email, says one of them to the other. Another gag line. Some days I just can't seem to get going. But, there are worse things than that. For instance, as a child, my father died when I was 5. I was sexually abused as a child. I was bullied in school. When I was 18, I learned I'd inherited the same disease that killed my father. And years later, after receiving a successful organ transplant, my description during a sermon of the experience of being on hemodialysis, having my blood run through a machine 3 times a week, caused one member in the congregation to faint dead away. We had the EMTs coming into the church to revive him. And I could go on, but this sermon is not about me. It's about all of us and our common situation. Because if emotion is inner weather, then by the time we've reached midlife, most of us have survived some severe storm advisories. Divorce, disease, dislocation, job loss, or maybe jobs like my sister-in-law's, a neonatologist at Johns Hopkins Intensive Care, who every day saw babies who were born prematurely, who were just too tiny to breathe, or with deformities and disabilities that no infant could survive. And she herself is on disability now, as are so many of our veterans and police officers and firefighters and other first responders, ourselves, our sisters and brothers, like so many victims of rape or incest or sexual abuse or domestic violence or childhood neglect and abandonment. You've probably heard the cliche, God never gives you more than you can handle. Baloney. This is exactly what God does. God stretches us to the breaking point and then way beyond that. Hirsch Wilson, who is the deputy chief at Hondo Fire, where I work as a volunteer, he talked about one of his experiences with the real effects of PTSD. Hirsch has a book coming out in a couple months. I'll recommend it when it's in print. It's a great book. He's a wonderful person. He walks dogs for the Humane Society. He's a soccer coach. He teaches a girls' league. He does all that besides fighting fires and being an EMT. And he'd come upon this scene just as he was coming back from a sports tournament. A family van had been hit head on by a drunk driver. It was a total wreck. There were 4 dead and 1 survivor. It was horrendous, but he did his job. He sucked it up. He was a man about it, a professional. He thought he'd handled that and compartmentalized it. But then a month later, he was driving down that exact same stretch of highway when he was stopped at a DUI checkpoint. And Hirsch said that when the policeman came to the window to see his license, he almost jumped out the window and strangled the guy. This was unthinking, irrational. It was a primal reaction. It was a trigger for all that unexpressed grief and pain and anger and sorrow that had lain inside like a time bomb, unexploded, just waiting to go off. And this is how it works, because the word trauma means wound, and we all carry unhealed wounds, psychic scars that haunt us. They live in the basement world of our minds, although they still affect our waking and our sleeping hours, hiding like some snag or boulder just under the surface of the running river that seems tranquil on the surface, but they're lurking there, waiting to toss us out of the raft and into the deep water, gasping for breath and panicky for our lives. Helping us to survive, to overcome and heal from trauma has been the historic role of myth and religion, including the public rituals of what's called civic religion. I'm sure you all remember how, not so long ago in 2015, a 21-year-old white supremacist named Dylan Roof walked into the Emmanuel Baptist Church in Charleston, South Carolina. He was welcomed there. He was invited in. He was asked to join in worship and prayer in this church, and then he shot 9 of the congregants, including the pastor and a state senator from this congregation that had been founded by Denmark Vesey. Vesey was himself a slave. He'd escaped in 1822 and tried to lead a black uprising, a crime for which he was hanged. And Emmanuel Baptist, which he founded, had to go underground after that. This historic church wasn't resurrected until after the Civil War. But then it began to grow. It became a center for civil rights organizing, for black pride. And then Dylan Roof's murderous reprisal took place on the anniversary of Denmark Vesey's death. It was a sick anniversary present. It was a heinous hate crime that shocked the nation, at least the decent people of the nation. And a few days later, President Barack Obama offered a eulogy to the victims of the massacre, a eulogy that ended as he began a cappella to sing Amazing Grace. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come. 'Twas grace that led us safe thus far, and grace will lead us home. And if you were watching that, you noticed he wasn't reading that off a teleprompter. He didn't have to read a teleprompter because he knew those words by heart, as many of us know them, although written back in 1772. We know them because these lyrics to Amazing Grace speak to some timeless truth about human extremity and hardship and the human capacity to endure. And President Obama did something remarkable as consoler-in-chief. He lifted us above the shattering senselessness of this crime and offered us a glimpse of hope and humanity that could briefly bring us together as a people, which is actually why we sing hymns here, I think. It's not because we're all fuddy-duddies. Certainly we're not vocal virtuosos. It's not because we're some crazy psalm-singing old biddies like Katharine Hepburn in The African Queen, when Humphrey Bogart accuses her of excessive prudery when she pours his gin down the river. You know, the reason we sing them is because these old songs, these old lyrics, they hang on for a reason. They have power, power to renew, to restore, to guide us through the traumas and wounds that have afflicted generations. And we sing them because if we don't need them right now, if we don't need them today, we may need them tomorrow. So we may have forgotten the place in the forest, and we don't know how to light the fire. All we can do here is sing the songs and tell the stories of resilience, and somehow it's enough. So here's another story for you. When I was serving as minister in Worcester, Massachusetts, this was back in 2013, I had to take my prepared Sunday sermon and tear it up and write a new one almost overnight, because that was the weekend of the Boston Massacre bombing that killed 3, that dismembered over a dozen, that wounded hundreds of innocent bystanders. That was a bewildering, numbing, tragic day. Random, deadly, could have been any of us, and we grieved the victims. But collectively, as Americans, we also reviled and dehumanized the perpetrators, because for weeks afterward, the corpse of Tamerlan Tsarnaev, who was one of the 2 Chechnyan brothers who committed this atrocity, that body lay in the basement of a Worcester mortuary about a mile from where I worked, because no cemetery would accept the body. In a blog for the Worcester Telegram, I wrote that the body of Tamerlan Tsarnaev deserves burial. The corpse of the Boston Marathon bomber has been under refrigeration at a funeral home in Worcester on South Main Street for many days, with protesters gathered outside and no local cemetery willing to accept the remains. This is indefensible. Since ancient times, proper internment of the dead has been a mark of a civilized society, a universally recognized moral injunction. In Sophocles' play Antigone, the king of Thebes, Creon, brings down the wrath of the gods on his family when he refuses to allow the heroine for whom the drama is named to bury her brother, Polynices, who had rebelled against the state, Creon ruling that the body has to be left to rot on the plain, and transgressing the king's decree, heaping earth on her slain sibling. Antigone proclaims to Creon that no mortal can override the unwritten, unfailing statutes of heaven. In his great book, Theater of War, author Brian Dories describes how the ancient Greeks used dramas like Antigone as a means of social catharsis and purgation. And he explains that Sophocles was not just an author. He wasn't just a playwright. Sophocles was a military general. He was a commander in a militia where all Athenian men were citizen soldiers, and where Athenian women saw their warriors come home physically and psychologically scarified from hand-to-hand combat, from delivering death at sword point, from holding dying comrades in arms, The theater 24 centuries ago was not a place of light entertainment in those days. It was a haven of communal solidarity and safety, where the most disturbing and harshest truths could be spoken in a framework that could hold and contain these raw, bleeding edges of life. And these plays, Oedipus Rex, Antigone, Ajax, along with scripts of his contemporary, Aeschylus, these were jarring dramas. They were not in the comfort zone. Incest, matricide, child sacrifice. But Doris, who has restaged these old Greek plays, put on public performances in places like Ferguson, Missouri, where the dead body of 18-year-old Michael Brown was permitted to lie uncovered and visible in the street, an object of horror and pity and astonishment to his family, his friends, his neighbors, to casual passers-by, lying there for hours after being shot reportedly with his hands up, shot in the back by a white police officer. It finds that these old plays, like Antigone, still have the power not just to outrage, but also to heal, to unify communities who need some common narrative of how individuals can survive and persevere and go on despite the inhumanity and savagery of brutal systems of power. We don't always succeed here, but that is what we're trying to do. Partly, in my opinion, as a community of faith, we're trying to offer a place where painful truths can be told and vented and purged, to sing songs of shipwreck and rescue and survival, to hold our common suffering in a vessel that's large enough, that's strong enough to contain it, to confine it in bounds that acknowledge the pain without letting it overwhelm us. And truly, we never completely do heal from the wounds we suffer. At some level, the scars are always there. They're painful. They're tender to the touch. And for those whose minds have been ravaged, who wake up screaming every night, or who can't go to sleep at all for dread of what might come in their dreams, there are therapies and modalities that have been proven to help with PTSD. But for the rest of us, for the walking wounded, for all of us who carry the normal human burdens of tears and travail, there's also help. We come here and we retell these old Greek and Christian and Buddhist myths that have at the core some saving message, because these aren't just old legends. They're lasting truths about our human condition. Our mortal fate is suffering. It's pain. We're all hurt, haunted, and broken. We've been damaged and disgraced, and we've been disempowered and crucified. But grace will lead us home with the help of friends, with the power of love, with the medicine of truth. We will not only persevere or persist, but consecrate and hallow, able truly to sing, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen." Glory, hallelujah.